I've just got off the phone from a journalist who saw my last LinkedIn update when I was talking about last week's episode with Alexandra Annabelle from Tech4Ds about disaster fatigue. Now, I've known this journalist for decades, and she knows this problem, but from the journalism side of disaster fatigue and how people get tired of that sort of in-depth journalism of stuff that perhaps people have heard before. And it got me thinking. To give you a bit of background on her, and I hope to get her on the show at some point, she's covered like the aftermath of the Bosnian War, talking from Sarajevo, the city which was absolutely divided during that war. She's writing a book on that. Was also in Iraq and worked for major tabloids in the United Kingdom as well. And she now lectures on journalism too. And the conversation got onto the topic of the problem journalists have getting paid for creating quality journalism these days. So, in other words, good in-depth stories, so to speak, rather than your kind of rip and read stories. And I'll put some notes on what I'm about to say in the next newsletter as well, which as usual, it's at thepublicrelationspodcast.com, thepublicrelationspodcast.com. So she gave an example where she talked about how she went and did a piece on Aboriginal life in Australia. And she spent time living in this community, camping out and writing the piece. And what she found was that no one was prepared to pay for it. They wanted the content, they wanted to run it, but they weren't prepared to pay a journalist to do it. And this has been a growing trend in journalism and a growing problem for journalists for a long time. In fact, I was putting a module together for the Public Relations Podcast project the other day on the way that media has changed and where it's going. And this is very much a factor. It's very common. In fact, I can speak from experience as well, because one of the reasons that I think I became an editor at the ITN, which I said before is the UK's second largest news organisation, was because I did a whole lot of stuff for free that helped me to get my name out there, got me some connections in the journalism world and helped me to get in the door. It opened the door for me. So the conversation I had with her raised two thoughts in my mind. One, that there is an opportunity for PRs to not just pitch a story to a journalist and call it done, but to help the journalist and promote it. In other words, using PR skills with a journalist in the same way that you would treat a client. So helping the journalists make a name for themselves and in turn helping them promote the story that we want them to get across. And secondly, that journalists themselves, if they want a great career in quality news, in those sort of more in-depth stories, perhaps need to start learning a bit from the PR industry as well. Now, in my experience, when I was a journalist, we made stories and we didn't market them at all after we'd made them. We never thought like PR people do. So there was just this kind of, feeling that the story would carry itself. People would share it because it was an interesting story and because it was running on the outlet where we worked, that would kind of do everything for it. But there's now, of course, so much noise out there that not just for PRs, but for journalists too, that if you want to advance your career, you need to shout about what you do and make a personal name for yourself. So this is just as relevant for journalists. One of the problems with pay scales in journalism is at the bottom, you can get some pretty terrible money. If you get to the top by making a name for yourself, that money is good. People still ask, journalists, they get paid really well for what they're doing. They must have a lot of fun. Yeah, they do have a lot of fun, but they don't get paid well apart from at the top. So few journalists have this sort of PR mindset. And indeed, some of them, I think, despise the whole concept of PR. And we can see how some journalists kind of turn to political campaigning or slanted stories to try and reach a particular market segment and to get known in that as a campaigning journalist. And who can blame them? There's some great journalists doing that. But that doesn't really suit many journalists who still aspire for that sort of objective approach, like the person I was talking to, or the deeply researched stories. So is there an opportunity here, as I say, for PRs to help out? This is what we were talking about. Can PR people perhaps help the journalists promote themselves and their story by using the PR skills in return for some coverage and goodwill? Well, let's say, for example, I was just sort of having a brainstorm before I started recording this after I chatted to her. And let's say that you want to place a story and the journalist goes for it. And they write a great piece, but they can't get paid for it. Even though it's an amazing story, it gets no traction because they're not pushing it. Well, do you know a politician, for example, who perhaps could say, this is a story that must be read because it's part of a campaign they're doing? Does the story support a theme that the politician is trying to bang on about? Could that story be used as part of a campaign where the politician says, I was reading this story that journalist X is researching the other day, and I think that journalist has got it right, and it's something that everyone should be reading and should be published, to help that journalist pitch it to news outlets because people are talking about this story already. This is an example, as I say, off the top of my head, but there's tons of other ways of approaching this, of course. In fact, if you think about it, let's say you make satellite phones and you spotted the recent earthquake in Turkey. If we go back to that episode with Alexandra Annabelle. You reach out to a journalist who wants to cover this, but they don't have the resources from their newsroom to go and do it. And there's going to be poor phone coverage in a disaster zone, which there always is. So perhaps you then say, well, look, we'll give you a phone, maybe even pay the bill in return for them covering the story, but making sure that they somehow use the phone in that coverage in some way. There's nothing wrong here. It would be useful for them to use that phone. So why not offer it? All of a sudden, they have a way to cover the story, a chance for them to really prove themselves. Perhaps if their newsroom has no budget, they'll be able to suddenly go and do this story and cover it. And also, as I've found from my own experiences, that when you go to things and you're actually on site, people will use it. And that helps you to make a name for yourself with other outlets that you might move to in the future. But let's say they actually go and do this, and then the story dies because of disaster fatigue. They get a bit of coverage, but then it sort of peters out after there. Many journalists would then, as I say, just give up because they don't think they're PRs. But, for example, do you know, through your work as a PR, maybe the Turkish language press who might run that story with with a strong satellite phone angle? Are there Turkish influencers that maybe you can reach out to? Are there outlets who might love a new angle on the story that you can connect the journalist to? For example, like the disaster press, the emergency press, even local fire and rescue newsletters that this stuff could be going out in, mentioning the use of the phone and the coverage that they did. As long as that journalist is going to get some mentions of them using the phone, and they've got good reason to, because you're giving them something which is going to genuinely help them out in that situation, then they can be using this as a hook to go and talk to other people. At the minimum, if they go and give a talk at some social club, they could be talking about the fact that they used the phone. If you think like a journalist, that story of the satellite phone and going to Turkey obviously has lots of angles. But just on the technology, just on the satellite phone itself, the technology press are going to be interested in that kind of thing. The satellite phone press, which that story of the satellite phone and going to Turkey obviously has lots of angles. But just on the technology, just on the satellite phone itself, the technology press are going to be interested in that kind of thing. The satellite phone press would obviously love it as a case study of your phone being used in a real deep situation, which they're not going to go and cover themselves. So it's an example of the technology being used on the ground with real human impact, with a real human case study. It helps to promote the industry. So I'm sure they would run stuff like this. Talking about what your satellite phone does and how it's changing the world. There's some good angles in there. I'm brainstorming here. There are probably loads more angles if I sat down for a few minutes, but you get the point. Everyone wins here. And we're not compromising this sort of objective journalism. We're actually helping them advance their careers, do objective journalism, but making sure that we get mentioned in there too. The more we can market them and that story, the more others are going to talk about it. And as we know with PR, it's always better to get others to say things than us ourselves saying it, because it always carries more credibility. There's nothing worse, isn't there, than putting out a statement yourself and people go, well, of course they're going to say that. But when other people start talking about it, then you get far more credibility. And here's another idea off the top of my head. Quality journalism lends itself to making podcasts and lots of opportunities to repurpose content with quality journalism because you're coming up with so many more angles. Maybe you can encourage them or even help them to do that. Of course, this is all PR, but the point here is the motivation. Journalists want to be heard. They want to be respected. They want to be loved for their work. And if we can help them get their message across, then we can help ourselves. There's plenty of journalists who might say, okay, I don't want to compromise my integrity. But in this age where they need to find ways to get their stories out, if they want to cover these deeper, more interesting stories that are going to take more time and not just the rip and read stories, then they may need to find new, innovative ways to do that. Perhaps PR people can help them to be heard by using PR contacts and PR skills. Maybe you're doing this kind of thing already, but speaking to journalists, it doesn't sound like a lot of PRs are helping out journalists to really push the stories and help them promote their own careers. But maybe you are doing it. What have you found by doing that? What lessons have you learned? I'm sure there's problems to this approach as well. I would love to know. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Richard Midson. That's Midson. That's Midson. You are listening to the Public Relations Podcast. I am Richard Midson, with the goal of helping everyone who listens to this show to stand out in their PR operations every day. I hope this show is helping you to do that with some ideas like this one. If there's something else you want to hear from the show, of course, let me know too. I'll round up a few more of the thoughts that I had in this episode and some others I'm sure I'll have in a few minutes' time in the newsletter next time, which you can find at the publicrelationspodcast.com. And if you're interested in the Public Relations Podcast project as well, details also on the website at the publicrelationspodcast.com. Just click on the project button that you'll see at the top and you can find out more about that too. That's it for the moment. As soon as I see something else going on in the PR world, I will update you. I hope you are having an awesome start to the week, and I'll speak to you real soon.